Hello, everybody. Welcome to JMU College of Business Business Insights Speaker Series. My name is Mert Tukman. I'm a professor of marketing and logistics in the College of Business. And I'm also the coordinator of the Global Supply Chain Minor, and I'm your host today. During the month of May, our speaker series will focus on supply chain disruptions caused by COVID-19 pandemic. Our speaker today is Mr. David Grant. David is the co-founder and partner of Potomac Ridge Consulting Firm. He is a senior executive with over 35 years of experience in procurement, acquisition, program management, and leadership, with 18 years in the senior service, executive service in the US government. In his most recent public service role, David served as FEMA's Associate Administrator for Mission Support and Component Acquisition Executive. And he was responsible for agency-wide integrated support operations. For much of 2017, David served as the FEMA's Acting Deputy Administrator. In this role, he was leading the operation of the agency during transition of administration and departmental leadership and continuing of operations for critical agencies programs. Prior to becoming the Associate Administrator for Mission Support, Mr. Grant served as the Chief Procurement Officer for FEMA and IRS, respectively. David is a recipient of numerous public sector service awards, such as the Presidential Rank Award, Treasury and DHS Secretarial Awards, IRS Commissioner Awards, and FEMA Administrator Awards. David is a graduate of James Madison University and currently serves as the chair of JMU Global Supply Chain Management Executive Advisory Board, and also as a founding member of the JMU Federal Dukes Alumni Group. So before we start David's presentation, I'd like to remind the audience that we will take live questions after David's presentation, and you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. David, the stage is yours now. We can start your presentation.
Great, thank you. Let me share screen. Okay, everyone see the screen? Perfect, okay. So Mert, thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to folks. As Mert said, I'm participating with JMU in their program around global supply chain management. And we have a series of speakers to talk about the effect of COVID-19 on the supply chain, and my perspective will be on the federal supply chain. So I'm going to start here. Now, we have had some problems with this nation's supply chain management for quite some years, but I'm going to go back a few years and talk about the inclusion of China in the World Trade Organization in 2001. Since that time, supply chains have become more globalized, they have become leaner, and they have become somewhat more susceptible to risks, natural disasters, cyber attacks, labor disputes, and medical issues such as SARS, Ebola, and COVID-19. Since between 2001 and 2019, the global trade, the reliance in the global trade within the global GDP has risen from 39 to 58%. So global supply chain has become an increasingly important part of a nation state's economic status. The effect of COVID-19 pandemic and the accompanying economic crisis has just made the supply chain problems more exacerbated and more at risk. A couple of issues here. There is a significant lack of data throughout both corporate and public sector supply chain. We don't share information, we don't even have information. In many cases, what was shown during COVID-19 was we had the same overseas suppliers in China and Southeast Asia for raw materials, semi-produced products, and final produced products. And they were coming from the same suppliers. We had significant problems with logistics of delivery, both for onshore, and I'll talk about our own problems within this country, nearshore in this hemisphere, and offshore. Heavily, obviously, dependent on shipping with the offshore. And what we found was that Whole nation states would buy up time or confiscate entire shipping lines for shipping of needed products coming out of Asia. And we ended up having to rely on military transport planes in many cases, which is fine for an emergency situation, but they don't have the capacity. We didn't have the capacity to get the supplies that we needed via military transport plane. There was significant competition for that method of delivery. At one point, I was involved with the acquisition of N95 masks, and the nation of France bought about 40 million masks in one day that this country, CDC, was about to buy, but it came from a supplier in France, and they had cash on the barrelhead, and they sold them all to France. In a matter of hours, the entire sale went away. So the competition was significant. And we also had an introduction in the global supply chain management. They're always been there, but in this case, the role of brokers grew exponentially. Speculative buying came out of virtually every corner of the world, and would buy up huge quantities of masks, oxygen, medical supplies, gowns, gloves, whatever we needed. And these speculators would buy them and then would sell them on the open market at sometimes 3, 4, 5, 10 times the going price. Price gouging became an inordinate problem. Masks that used to sell for 50 cents would now sell for $10 or more. Additionally, we had a significant problem with fraudulent or fake products. So at one point, we actually had HHS personnel that would be in China at the plant, stamping products as they came off, making sure that these are the products that we're going to get, and then we'd have to watch them and keep secure location director on the whole thing all the way through until it got to the US, because whole product lines would disappear and products would be substituted. The demand for these products increased 100-fold in a matter of weeks. And we found that the supply chain did not have the resilience. We're going to talk about resilience in a moment to make up for that. So some solutions to the problem. One of the first things the US did was implemented Defense Production Act, or DPA, which is great. It's a statute that allows the US government to direct a company to sell at the appropriate price, whatever the product is, and move our requirement ahead of all other requirements, whether that be state or local governments or other commercial entities. Some of the more interesting parts of DPA also is we could supply money, and we did. FEMA, my former agency, supplied large amounts of money to certain companies to move production of masks and other medical devices, gowns, gloves, etc., back to the US. And we paid for entire production lines to be set up from vacant facilities, and built the entire production line up so we could start building them here. And that's a great interim solution. I'm going to talk a little bit later about how that is difficult in the long term, because the companies then don't have the incentive to maintain that, and they tend to move back to the overseas production. We need to force data sharing and demand coordination. And I say force because, especially in times of need, many of these companies we find do not want to share data on their supply chain. They don't want to identify their source of supply. It's a competitive issue to them. They don't want their competitors to know. They frankly don't want the US government to know. And I understand that. But in a time of national emergency, what we found was many companies didn't have insight into their own supply chain data, let alone the ability or the desire to share it. But we needed to know it. And that's when we started finding out that many of the suppliers, there were only 2 or 3 manufacturers of some critical supply issues in medical field, gloves and gowns and such, in China. And many of the resellers here were all going back to the exact same manufacturer. Need to adopt some more flexible production capabilities. One of the things that we have found in some of my peers talking back to my old agencies is the ability of 3D printing as a new technology to step in. It is reconfigurable on a much faster scale than traditional production would be, traditional manufacturing. And we're going to have to find the ability to become more flexible. Some of the issues that we found with our own companies in this country are that there were sister kind of or brother or sister kind of functionalities that companies were not willing or didn't think that they could switch over. So a lot of non-medical supply manufacturing in the clothing, we tried to go to them and say, hey, can you make masks? Can you make gowns? And they found that they just didn't have the flexibility to turn those production lines into something that we could use. So if you think back to World War II, for example, almost all the car production lines in this country turned around and made tanks and Jeeps and things like that for the war, and they did it pretty quickly. That's the kind of flexibility we're talking about here. If you're making, blue jeans or making shirts or something like that, you should be able to flip your production around and make a different kind of fabric within the standards of the medical supply needs, gowns, gloves, etc., masks. But we found that there was an inability to do so, and at first a lack of interest to do so, because they were interested in what it would cost them to do. And that's where the Defense Production Act came in, and we started investing with companies to make sure that they could do that. Identifying alternative delivery mechanisms. What we really found was the delivery heavily reliant on the shipping coming from Asia. And the big issue then came onshore here. There were only certain ports on the West Coast in particular that could handle the volume of ships that were starting to come in. And because the borders were closed down, we couldn't use Vancouver, for example, or you couldn't use a port in Alaska because you didn't have the ability to ship directly via road system or train. So we need to, I'm going to get to it in the end, some of the recommendations to improve our hard infrastructure here in this country. The cost to get through the Panama Canal to come to the East Coast was significant, and many of the ships were too big to fit through the Panama Canal. So what we found was we had actually ships offshore that would sometimes wait days or weeks to get into the port to unload their needed supplies. And if that port had a COVID outbreak, it would be shut down for days at a time while they did cleaning. So there was a hard infrastructure issue at this end of that world global supply chain. One of the things we need to do, I put in quotes, we need to encourage suppliers to model their supply chain, identifying roadblocks and share data. And those roadblocks are going to come from the acquisition of raw materials, the semi-produced products, the final produced products, the shipping in between all those stages, and the final arrival here in this country. And the lack of data, again, was stunning to leadership in our agencies here, that companies did not have the ability to identify those roadblocks and share the data with their subcontractors, their subcontractors, and ultimately their customer, in my case, the US government. Problem two, structural problems in global supply chains. There is, and I use the term here purposely, a dangerous over-reliance on Chinese manufacturing. This country has, and not just this country, companies across the world since about 2001 have really highlighted on efficiency, lean, efficient, very effective supply chains. What we found is that companies no longer keep days or even weeks, or let alone months of supply in their pipeline in case there's an issue. It is very much of an on-demand, deliver as ordered kind of supply chain. And that's great for being lean and efficient. What it also results in is often brittle and typically very dependent on offshore manufacturing, because labor is cheap, land is cheap, and they find it just cheaper to manufacture many of these products overseas and ship them here when needed. And there's a problem with that. So I'm going to talk here in a few minutes about some improvements there. The need for supply chain networks to improve their resiliency and agility. To build resilience into the network, you're going to have to build capacity into the network. We're going to need to have more than one or two suppliers of critical necessary parts, both from raw materials to the manufacturing, the supplies needed to manufacture the actual plant itself, as well as the finished product. And we don't have that. Again, the lean and efficient approach doesn't build into that, the need to have that resiliency. and the singular focus on operating margins and efficiency. If you want to be lean, that's great. Operating margins and efficiency are critical. If you want to be resilient, then you need to focus a balance between the operating margin, efficiency, and resiliency. And right now, we don't have the balance. What COVID-19 exposed in glaring spotlight was that we are heavily and overly reliant on lean operating margins, and there was no capacity to switch to a different supplier, no capacity to switch to different delivery, no capacity to switch to manufacture different product lines. All of those things take investment, and those things don't reflect well on the bottom line. So we have to find a balance there. So some solutions to that problem. Number one, information, data, rapid detection of disruption. Oftentimes companies didn't know that the product that they thought had been shipped hadn't been shipped. We found many cases where frankly the Chinese government would come into a plant and confiscate. They passed a law about 2 months into the COVID disaster that they could confiscate 40% of the raw materials being used to make masks because they needed them for their own population, and they weren't going to have the plants manufacturing and shipping out, so they would confiscate the raw materials. They would confiscate oftentimes the masks as they come off. So no one really knew that disruption was there. They didn't have an end-to-end understanding and a control and an insight and a view of the entire supply chain. They did not have redundancy, so we need to build in a redundancy. And I'm going to talk in a few minutes about nearshore, offshore, and onshore for building redundancy, because by redundancy, you have to include geographic redundancy. There is, in many cases, frankly, the mask, the gowns, medical supplies, probably 80–90% of that comes from Southeast Asia, primarily China. And that is a risk to this country. So then we have to have a collaboration across all members of the supply chain. And that's, I mentioned earlier, the various levels of supplier, the OEM, the manufacturer, the subcontractor, the piece parts, the shipping companies. All of those companies need to be an integral part and share data across our supply chain. And what we found are shipping companies weren't sharing with the folks who were placing the orders. The raw material folks who were shipping the raw materials weren't sharing where the raw materials were. There just wasn't the insight, so that we need to encourage and incentivize a collaboration for all members of that supply chain to share information. One of the most important things is the adoption of risk management and mitigation. And that is, as I said earlier, a balance between the lean and efficient approach, which is most important to the bottom line, and risk management and mitigation, which is most important to resiliency. And we have to adopt some level of balance there. One of the things that I talk about is also increasing availability of raw materials. Again, if you have singular sources, and oftentimes it was Southeast Asia for raw materials, then those raw materials would get diverted to other nation states, and we were left high and dry. So, and then that marries up with diversifying production capabilities. So I'm going to talk here a little bit about nearshore, onshore, and offshore. Onshore is within the confines of this country. Nearshore is within the Western Hemisphere, and offshore is obviously, anywhere else in the world. The benefit of nearshore is that you can have a road structure and a rail structure and much shorter shipping lines that could come to either coast. It increases your flexibility and the ability to take care of a disaster. Let's say there was an earthquake on a port in South America on the West Coast, you could go to the East Coast and ship things, that kind of thing. Whereas if you're offshore, if you're coming in from Asia, you're stuck with the shipping lines, and those shipping lines were confiscated. So we need to diversify within this country the availability of raw material and production capabilities to include a measure of onshore in this country, offshore, Asia, Africa, Europe, wherever it might be, and nearshore, Western Hemisphere. Next slide. So building agility. I mentioned earlier 3D manufacturing, and we need to build in the agility, the ability to switch what you're manufacturing to like or similar items. So my example of before, instead of building cars, they built Jeeps or tanks. In this country, it took significant government involvement and financial investment that happened, that took several months to happen, to get companies to move manufacturing of gowns and masks and gloves onshore, or moving from making shirts or pants or something like that into making gowns or something else. And they didn't have the flexibility. Their machines were not very agile, and we need to figure out a way to incentivize companies to build in to their manufacturing lines more the ability to be agile and switch production lines in case of another national emergency. We need to encourage them to share global data on all aspects of their supply chain in a safe and secure way. And I'm going to talk about cybersecurity here in a minute as well. As you guys have probably heard, there's a attempt at ransomware for one of our pipelines that is affecting the availability of gasoline in this country. Cybersecurity is one of the soft infrastructure we're going to talk about in a moment. The last part is about distributed sourcing of raw materials and production. We really need to reduce our reliance on Southeast Asia, particularly China, who is an adversarial nation to this country, especially for critical infrastructure that would be IT products, public health issues, or anything that we need in that regard, particularly pharmaceuticals. So how can public and private sector work together to improve the dynamic supply chain? Number one, we have to agree what critical infrastructure is. For national security, public health, safety, national economy, there has to be some consensus about what aspects of that supply chain are critical to this country. We have to put policies and subsidies and tax incentives in place to allow for the country's industrial base to consistently compete, both for the lean approach and for resiliency. And that tax incentive, so the example that I gave a few minutes ago, we actually helped a company build out production lines to make masks and gowns. And they did. It was through the Defense Production Act. We gave millions and millions of dollars. They built out the lines and they started churning out very good products within days. That's great. But a year from now, nobody that I talk to expects that plant to be operational, because we turn it over to them. It's their plant. They can still do it cheaper, leaner, more efficiently overseas. So once the demand goes down, it will not be in their economic best interest to do so. So we have to, in my opinion, put policies, subsidies, and tax incentives in place to keep some portion of that critical public infrastructure, the ability to manufacture and deliver from within this country or nearshore within this hemisphere. This country should adopt, in my opinion, a model that utilizes those three areas: nearshore, offshore, and onshore. And we have to keep those incentives, those economic policies and tax incentives in place for the long term. This supply chain issue can't be resolved every time a pandemic comes up and you go throw a bunch of money at it. It's very inefficient, and it stops our economy from being competitive. We have to invest in it for the long term. We have to establish more open and transparent view into real-time data, both public and private sector. As I mentioned earlier, the private sector is loath to share information for fear of competitive imbalance for themselves. They don't want their competitors to know. They don't want the government to know. They want to manage it themselves. And that may be well earned. But if anything, this pandemic has shown that we need to be better at sharing data in a secure manner so that we can make informed decisions and see real-time disruption as it's happening and make decisions to move product to a different channel that we need here in this country. And the last part I mentioned just briefly, the hard infrastructure, ports, airports, rail, highway, etc. We found huge clogging was going on. Both ships to get into Los Angeles is the biggest port. It got shut down a number of days because of COVID. There were few alternative sites to bring these big ships into. Once we got there, we found that the trucking industry was slow to respond. They had COVID issues for themselves. It was just piling up and backing up. So we need to make an improvement in our hard infrastructure, as well as the soft infrastructure. There were cybersecurity attacks. Many of them didn't make the papers. We have policies, procedure, data analysis, all the things behind the scenes that we can do internally to give companies the flexibility or freedom, let's say, from some regulations that might inhibit them from doing that. We need to come together collectively and figure out how behind the scenes we can make things move more smoothly, as well as improving and making permanent some of those hard infrastructure improvements. As an example, China has invested over $1 billion on the continent of Africa to build hard roads, bridges, and ports. They've just done this. They call it the RBI, I think it is. I don't know what that acronym stands for. And they're building from raw material points within that continent that they want to buy, and then they're building the infrastructure themselves so it can get to a port so they can get it. That's a long-term investment that country is making to keep their sources of supply available to them. So that is the end of my presentation. I'm going to take us off the screen share, and then Mert, I'll turn it back to you and we'll see if we have any questions.
Thank you, David. Those were wonderful insights, and it was fantastic. We will now take some questions from the audience, and then the first one actually comes from Dean Busing, and he's asking, since the pandemic is changing rapidly and the demand for PPE will likely taper off and cease to exist at some point, how do you make sure the supply chain provides enough PPE while not having an excess supply at the end of the demand cycle?
Well, that gets back to that balance between resiliency and efficiency. And right now, so I sort of think of this as the pendulum that swings back and forth. And we have swung very hard to the pendulum on the side of being lean and efficient and increasing the bottom line, which is great. There's certainly benefit to that. And that's where I think we have to come up with tax policies and subsidies to encourage companies to invest in production capabilities nearshore in this hemisphere and in this country, so that they can keep some portion of that here, so that if another pandemic happens, we'll have the ability to at least keep things going while other sources are found. The other thing, and I've actually heard this from a number of companies, they are moving production out of China, maybe to other portions of Southeast Asia that we have a more, workable relationship with, Thailand, Vietnam, etc., and looking at the various nations within Africa that may be easier for us to deal with. So I think it's a combination of finding geographically dispersed and divergent areas of supply and manufacturing capability, and providing tax and policy incentives to keep some portion of manufacturing capability here in this country.
Excellent, thank you. And another question is, how do you force data sharing? Is this through some informal mechanism, an incentive, or do the laws allow it?
Well, right now, we can't really, that I'm aware of. I mean, I'm not a legal expert in this regard. I think the forcing is probably too strong a word. So finding a way to force it is probably not going to work very well. I think we have to do is incentivize it. And again, I think one of the big concerns that I've heard from companies that I've personally spoken with is the fear that their data would then be exposed to their competitors. So we have to be very concerned with cybersecurity. We have to put a system in place where companies can share information with us and be confident that it will not get out to their competitors. That is a big, big concern of theirs. Nor would it then be used by the US government to harm them in some way, right? So I think it's going to be an incentive. I think it's going to have to be an open conversation. I think we have to get the major manufacturers of certain critical infrastructure in this country together, and obviously medical supplies or pharmaceuticals or chips or rubber or something like that, which are all right now issues in this country. We'll have different conversations, but I think it's going to be on the incentive side, not on the force side.
Thank you, David. Another question is, in disruptive situations like COVID, what is the right balance between the federal government taking over the responsibility to manage the supply chains versus leaving the decision-making to individual states and local authorities?
Well, I've spent most of my career, if not all my career, actually, except the last 3 years in public sector. And I will tell you, the government is incapable of taking over management of the supply chain. It's not what we do. And I mean, we even found, dealing with Defense Logistics Agency, which is, a huge entity and does a magnificent job in moving items to support the US military worldwide, but they're not nimble enough to handle the myriad of different products and sources of supply and sources of production around the world that we're talking about here. I mean, they're very focused on keeping Army, Air Force, Marines, et cetera, supplied with what they need. So this is different. So the government can't come in and run it. What we have to do is set standards for awareness of supply chain, insight into the full supply chain, and the ability to share that information, especially about disruption in the supply chain. So I think if we set standards and we incentivize companies to share information that doesn't put them at risk, we'll be able to do that.
Well, thank you so much, David, for making the time to speak to our audience today. Your experience and insights on the inner workings of this federal supply chain are truly invaluable. And as we close our event today, we thank you again, David. And I would like to remind our audience that we will have another wonderful speaker same time next week. Mr. Brian Tilton from Deloitte Consulting will be with us, and we would love to see you join us again. And thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. Thanks, Mert.